What happens when a greedy ex-wife tries to take everything, but ends up losing it all instead? Meet Daniel Hayes, a hard-working businessman who thought his nightmare ended with his divorce. But he was wrong. His ex-wife, Vanessa, wasn't just after alimony. She wanted more. She wanted to bleed him dry. But how did Vanessa's greed lead to her own downfall? What shocking courtroom revelation exposed her darkest secrets? And when she tried to destroy Daniel with a scandal, how did he flip the script and leave her with nothing? One brutal divorce, a battle of lies, deception, and revenge, and a shocking ending no one saw coming. Stick around because this is the story of how one man outsmarted his greedy ex-wife. And won big. Make sure to like the video and subscribe the channel so we can bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. The clock on the courtroom wall ticked with an almost mocking rhythm, each second stretching as if savoring the moment. Daniel Hayes sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Across from him, his ex-wife, Vanessa, radiated smugness, her expensive pearl earrings gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Mrs. Hayes... Miss, Vanessa corrected, flashing a saccharine smile. I've gone back to my maiden name. Daniel barely resisted rolling his eyes. Of course she had. Vanessa loved nothing more than reinvention, shedding people and identities like old snakeskin. The judge sighed. Miss Davenport, you are requesting an increased alimony settlement, claiming Mr. Hayes has not been transparent about his financial assets. Vanessa sat a little straighter. That's correct, Your Honor. Daniel has hidden assets, and I deserve my fair share. Daniel turned to his lawyer, Scott Fisher, who merely gave him a knowing glance. They were ready for this. They had been for months. Your Honor, Scott said, standing up smoothly, my client has provided full financial disclosures as required by law. However, we'd like to submit evidence suggesting that Miss Davenport's claims are not only unfounded, but intentionally misleading. Vanessa's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Daniel caught it. He had known her long enough to recognize when she was bluffing. The judge nodded. Proceed. Scott handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Contained in this file are financial statements, tax returns, and, most importantly, business records for the last 3 years. These documents prove that not only has Mr. Hayes been truthful about his finances, but Miss Davenport has deliberately omitted certain assets of her own. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Vanessa's face lost a bit of its color. That's ridiculous, she scoffed, her voice sharper now. I've disclosed everything. Scott arched an eyebrow. Did you, Miss Davenport? Because according to our findings, you've been receiving substantial deposits from an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. Daniel allowed himself the smallest smile. It was Vanessa's turn to sweat. The judge frowned, flipping through the pages. Miss Davenport, do you have an explanation for this? Vanessa's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time in the entire divorce saga, she was on the back foot. Scott didn't stop there. Furthermore, our private investigator uncovered proof that Miss Davenport purchased a luxury villa in Marbella under a shell company. She never declared this property in her financial disclosures, despite claiming to be in dire need of additional support. Gasps erupted. Vanessa's lawyer frantically flipped through their own papers, unprepared for this ambush. Daniel sat back, letting the moment sink in. Vanessa had spent years manipulating, scheming, taking more than she ever gave. But this time, she had underestimated him, and he wasn't done yet. The real twist was still coming. Before Vanessa could stammer out a response, Scott continued, Additionally, Your Honor, we've obtained signed affidavits from Miss Davenport's former financial advisor and real estate agent, confirming that she actively concealed these assets during the divorce proceedings. The judge's eyes darkened as he turned the page, his expression growing sterner by the second. Miss Davenport, this is a serious accusation. Do you understand the consequences of financial deception in a legal proceeding? Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her composure cracking. I was going to declare those assets, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Scott pressed on. That's not all, Your Honor. Miss Davenport also transferred significant sums of money to a private account in Luxembourg just days before filing for increased alimony. The timing is more than suspicious. It suggests an attempt to shield funds from this court's jurisdiction. Vanessa's lawyer finally found his voice. Your Honor, my client had no intention of deception. These are merely financial oversights. Scott smirked. Oversights? The offshore accounts, the shell company, the secret transfers, all oversights? If that's the case, perhaps Miss Davenport wouldn't mind a full forensic audit of her finances. The color drained from Vanessa's face. She knew what that meant. A forensic audit would expose every hidden transaction, every penny she had tucked away. If she fought this, she could end up not only losing her alimony claim, but facing fraud charges. The judge sighed heavily. Miss Davenport, unless you have an immediate and valid explanation, I will be forced to consider Mr. Hayes's motion to dismiss your request for increased alimony and investigate the possibility of financial misconduct on your part. Vanessa's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. Her lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but she barely seemed to hear him. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had walked into the courtroom expecting to leave with a bigger payout, not the looming threat of legal repercussions. Daniel allowed himself a deep breath. For the first time in years, he felt like he was winning. He had played the long game, gathered his evidence, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Vanessa had underestimated him, and now she was paying the price. Vanessa's lawyer straightened his tie and attempted to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, we request a recess to review these new documents and respond accordingly. The judge glanced at the courtroom clock. I will grant a 20-minute recess. As soon as the judge left the bench, Vanessa spun toward her lawyer, her carefully manicured nails digging into his sleeve. Fix this, she hissed. Daniel stood, stretching his arms, feeling the tension in his muscles ease. Scott leaned toward him and whispered, She's panicking. I can see that, Daniel murmured. He took a slow, satisfied breath. For years, he had been the one blindsided, the one left scrambling. It felt good to turn the tables. Vanessa's lawyer paced the room, speaking in hushed tones into his phone. She sat stiffly, staring straight ahead, her lips pressed into a thin line. Scott smirked. She's calling in favors. Won't help. Daniel nodded. They had built their case too well. Even if she tried to manipulate her way out of this, she wouldn't be able to erase the evidence. When the judge returned, the courtroom settled into silence. Miss Davenport, the judge said, his voice firm, have you or your counsel prepared a response to these allegations? Vanessa's lawyer stood, clearing his throat. Your Honor, we respectfully argue that the newly submitted financial records require independent verification. In the meantime, we request that the motion for increased alimony remain under consideration. Scott rose, his expression calm but unyielding. Your Honor, we anticipated this response. That's why we already had an independent forensic accountant verify every document before submitting them to this court. The findings are ironclad. The judge studied the files once more before speaking. Then I see no reason to delay my decision. A hush fell over the room. Miss Davenport's request for increased alimony is denied. Furthermore, given the evidence presented, I am compelled to order a full investigation into her financial disclosures. Should any further fraud be discovered, the court will proceed with appropriate legal consequences. Vanessa inhaled sharply, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. This is unfair, she blurted out, rising from her seat. The judge fixed her with a cold stare. Miss Davenport, I suggest you sit down before you make matters worse. She slumped back into her chair, stunned into silence. Daniel exchanged a brief glance with Scott. They had won, and Vanessa knew it. As the courtroom emptied, she shot him a glare filled with venom. "You think you've beaten me?" she spat. Daniel chuckled softly. "I don't think, Vanessa. I know." With that, he turned and walked away, feeling lighter than he had in years. Vanessa stormed out of the courtroom with her lawyer trailing behind her, whispering frantic advice she wasn't listening to. She was too consumed with rage, too blinded by the humiliating defeat she had just suffered. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had spent years crafting the perfect narrative, that she was the victim, the devoted wife discarded for a younger model, forced to scrape by while Daniel lived in luxury. And for a while, it had worked. Judges had sympathized, lawyers had nodded along, and Daniel had begrudgingly paid. But now, the tables had turned. Daniel stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, inhaling deeply. The weight he had carried for years was finally beginning to lift. Scott joined him with a satisfied grin. "You handled that like a champ," Scott said, clapping him on the back. "Did you see her face? Priceless." Daniel smirked. "I saw, and I enjoyed every second of it." "Now that we've won this round, what's next?" Daniel's smirk deepened. "Oh, this isn't over yet." Scott raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Daniel turned, watching Vanessa from a distance as she argued with her lawyer near the courthouse steps. She was unraveling, furious and desperate. "I want everything she took from me," Daniel said, his voice steady, "and I want to make sure she can never do this to anyone else." Scott nodded slowly. "I assume you're referring to her little offshore empire?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Exactly." Scott exhaled. "It won't be easy. She's slippery." Daniel turned to face his lawyer, a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. "Then we outmaneuver her again. We use every legal avenue we have. She buried assets to cheat me out of money. Now we make her pay it back. Every last cent." Scott chuckled. "You really want to twist the knife, huh?" Daniel's expression was unreadable. "I just want justice." Vanessa, still arguing with her lawyer, suddenly turned her head and met Daniel's gaze. Her lips curled into a sneer, but behind it there was something else, a flicker of fear. Daniel didn't look away. For the first time, she knew, really knew, that he wasn't the same man she had walked all over for years, and that terrified her. Vanessa gripped her phone so tightly her nails dug into her palm. She paced her penthouse living room, the lights of the city flickering through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her. "This is a disaster," she seethed into the receiver. "How did this happen? How did he outplay us?" Her lawyer's voice came through the speaker, strained. "We didn't anticipate that level of preparation, Vanessa. He had everything lined up perfectly." "I pay you to anticipate things like this," she snapped. "Now the judge is ordering a forensic audit. Do you have any idea what they'll find?" Silence. She squeezed her eyes shut, breathing hard. She knew exactly what they would find. The offshore accounts, the hidden investments, the secret property transfers. They weren't just going to take away her alimony, they were going to ruin her. "I need a way out," she said, her voice lower now, more desperate. "Options. What do I do?" "There's not much we can do legally at this point," her lawyer admitted. "The judge's decision is final. The best move now is to cooperate, hope for leniency, and negotiate a settlement." Vanessa let out a bitter laugh. "Negotiate? With Daniel? He's out for blood." Her lawyer hesitated. "There is one possibility. I'm listening. If you can find something, anything on Daniel, we could use it as leverage, a counterattack. Maybe force a settlement that's less damaging to you." Vanessa's pulse quickened. "You want dirt on him?" "Yes, anything we can use to make him look bad. It doesn't even have to be illegal, just damaging enough that he'd rather settle than go through another fight." Vanessa smirked. This was the game she knew how to play. "I'll handle it," she said, hanging up. She poured herself a glass of wine and sank into the plush couch. If Daniel wanted war, he would get it. She picked up her phone again and dialed another number. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. "You owe me a favor," she said, swirling her wine, "and it's time to pay up." Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his office reviewing the final audit reports with Scott. "She's in real trouble," Scott said, flipping through the documents. "If the prosecution gets wind of this, she could be looking at tax fraud charges. Jail time isn't off the table." Daniel exhaled slowly. He hadn't expected things to spiral this far, but he wasn't about to stop now. "She's going to fight back," he said. "Vanessa doesn't know how to lose gracefully." Scott leaned back in his chair. "Let her. We're 2 steps ahead." Daniel stared at his reflection in the window, his jaw tightening. He had spent years being the one caught off guard. Not anymore. Vanessa was about to learn that the man she thought she had beaten was just getting started. Vanessa sat at her vanity, tapping her manicured nails against the polished wood. Her mind raced with strategies, schemes, anything that could give her an edge. Daniel thought he had her cornered. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She reached for her phone and dialed. A husky voice answered almost immediately. "Vanessa, been a long time." "I need information," she said smoothly. "On Daniel, anything useful?" A deep chuckle. "Thought you'd never ask." This wasn't just any contact. It was Carter Blake, an old flame with a talent for digging up dirt. A fixer. "You got anything?" she asked, taking a slow sip of her wine. Blake hummed. "Hayes has been playing it clean since the divorce, but everyone's got skeletons. Give me a few days." "You have 24 hours, Vanessa said flatly, "and if you find something worthwhile, I'll make it worth your while." Blake laughed again. "Always a pleasure doing business with you, Vanessa." She ended the call, leaning back with a satisfied smirk. Daniel might have had the upper hand today, but the game wasn't over. It was just getting interesting. Across town, Daniel leaned against the kitchen counter, scrolling through the latest email from the forensic accountants. The depth of Vanessa's deception was staggering. She had been bleeding him dry for years while hoarding millions overseas. Scott sat across from him, sipping a coffee. "She's not going to take this lying down," he warned. "I know. Question is, are you ready for whatever she's planning?" Daniel set his phone down. "She's desperate, Scott. Desperate people make mistakes." Scott smirked. "And we'll be ready when she does." A knock at the door interrupted them. Daniel frowned and crossed the room. When he opened it, he was met with a woman in a navy blue suit, a folder clutched in her hands. "Mr. Hayes?" she asked. "Yes." She handed him the folder. "You've been served." Daniel's fingers tightened around the envelope. He exhaled slowly and nodded. "Thank you." The woman walked away without another word. Scott raised an eyebrow. That was fast. Daniel tore open the envelope, scanning the documents. His jaw clenched. "She's suing me for defamation." Scott whistled. Classic Vanessa move. Make herself the victim. Daniel tossed the papers onto the counter. "She thinks she can scare me into backing off." Scott leaned forward. "So what's the play?" Daniel met his gaze, a slow smirk forming. "We go for the kill." Vanessa lounged in her penthouse, swirling a glass of red wine as she watched the city lights flicker. The lawsuit was a bold move, but she knew how to play the legal game. Daniel might have won a battle, but she was about to drag him into a war he wasn't prepared for. Her phone buzzed. Carter Blake, right on time. "What do you have for me?" she asked, sitting up. Blake chuckled. "You're gonna like this." "I doubt that," she said dryly, "unless you found something that will bury Daniel." "Oh, I found something," Blake said. "You know that tech startup Daniel invested in 2 years ago?" Vanessa's fingers tightened around her glass. "Yes." "Well, looks like his partner was involved in some shady dealings. Fund mismanagement, unreported earnings, possible fraud. And guess who has his name all over those financial reports?" A slow smile spread across Vanessa's lips. "Daniel." "Bingo," Blake said. "Now, I can't say whether he knew about it or not, but from the outside, he looks guilty by association." Vanessa let out a small laugh. perfect. She leaned back against the couch, a surge of satisfaction filling her chest. She finally had a card to play. "Send me everything you have," she said, "and make sure it reaches the right people." Blake chuckled. "Consider it done." Vanessa ended the call and exhaled deeply. Daniel wanted to take everything from her? Let's see how he liked the taste of scandal. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his office flipping through his legal notes when Scott barged in, phone in hand. "We have a problem," Scott said. Daniel looked up. "What now?" Scott tossed his phone onto the desk. "Vanessa's team is leaking a story. Something about your old tech investment." Daniel frowned and picked up the phone. His heart sank as he read the headline. "Business mogul Daniel Hayes linked to financial fraud scandal." His grip tightened around the device. "She's desperate," Scott said. "She's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks." Daniel took a slow breath. He knew the deal Vanessa had made with herself. If she couldn't win in court, she'd destroy his reputation instead. "Tell me," he said, voice calm but lethal. "Is there any truth to this?" Scott shook his head. "Not on your end. Your former partner? He was the problem. But Vanessa's spinning it to make it look like you were complicit." Daniel exhaled, setting the phone down. "Then we fight fire with fire." Scott smirked. "I like the sound of that." Daniel leaned forward. "It's time to end this." Daniel didn't waste time. He had spent years being on the defensive, but not anymore. Scott worked the phones, calling in favors from trusted media sources, while Daniel contacted his own private investigator, someone far more thorough than the ones Vanessa had used. If she wanted a war, she was about to see what real strategy looked like. Hours later, Scott burst into Daniel's office, a triumphant grin on his face. "We've got her." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What did you find?" Scott tossed a thick file onto the desk. "Remember that little offshore account we exposed? Turns out that was just the tip of the iceberg." Daniel flipped through the documents, his eyes narrowing. "Vanessa's been laundering money through shell companies," Scott continued. "Not just hiding assets, straight-up financial crimes. And here's the kicker. One of those accounts is linked to a known tax evasion ring." Daniel let out a low whistle. "She's not just facing a financial scandal, this is criminal." Scott nodded. "And the authorities are very interested. If we hand this over, she won't just lose her money, she'll lose her freedom." Daniel leaned back, letting the moment sink in. He had wanted justice, not revenge. But Vanessa had escalated this to a point where she left him no choice. "Leak it," Daniel said finally. "Let the authorities handle the rest." Scott grinned. "Already in motion." 2 days later, the headlines changed. "Vanessa Davenport under federal investigation for tax fraud and money laundering." Daniel sat at his desk, watching the news as Vanessa was swarmed by reporters outside her penthouse. She looked disheveled, rattled, far from the confident woman who had walked into court demanding more money. One reporter shouted, "Miss Davenport, are the allegations true?" Vanessa's lips parted, but no words came out. The downfall was swift. The authorities moved in, seizing assets, freezing accounts. The woman who had spent years manipulating the system suddenly found herself powerless. And then came the final blow. Daniel's phone rang. It was Scott. "She caved," Scott said. "Her lawyer called. She's withdrawing her lawsuit, dropping all claims. She just wants it to end." Daniel exhaled. It was over. For the first time in years, he was free. A week later, Daniel walked along the beach, feeling the sand beneath his feet, the ocean breeze in his hair. No more court battles, no more legal fees, no more Vanessa looming over his life like a storm cloud. His phone buzzed, an unknown number. He answered. A quiet voice came through. "You won." Daniel didn't hesitate. "No, Vanessa, I just stopped losing." He ended the call, slipped his phone into his pocket, and walked toward the horizon, leaving the past behind. In life, trust is everything. But when that trust is broken, wisdom is your best weapon. Daniel didn't win by playing dirty. He won by playing smart. He gathered the facts, stayed patient, and struck at the perfect moment. This story proves that no matter how much someone tries to take advantage of you, knowledge, preparation, and a level head will always put you on top. If there's one thing to remember, it's this. Never let emotions cloud your judgment. Be smart, be strategic, and always stay one step ahead. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when interesting and lesson-packed stories like this one drop.